happened to Alyssa, why it happened to her, which part of her brain were injured, and why that causes her to be the way she is now. Then we'll talk a little bit about what I can do to help and what you can do to help. And then we'll have a question and answer session. These shorts are designed to be pretty short so that you don't get too sleepy and you have plenty of time to ask questions, okay? The second talk is about prenatal drug exposure. So for those of you who stay on for the second talk, I'll have what does prenatal drug exposure cause to the fetus, and what type of disorders might you see then in the classroom as a result of prenatal drug exposure. We'll do the same thing. We'll talk about the parts of the brain that are injured and why it causes what it causes, sort of what type of disorders you then see, and what you can do about it, and what I can do about it, and how we work together for that. Thank you, Michelle. That's awesome. In case you're interested, I also prepared an extra third little talk for you guys, only if you're interested and there is time, and it is on concussion. Concussion is a hot topic right now, and so for those of you who might be interested, we can talk a little bit about concussion, what you're supposed to do and how you manage concussion. So let's start with Alyssa's story, Kluver-Bucy syndrome. All right. So Alyssa was a perfectly normal little girl, right? Until it actually one more morning she woke up. I was talking with Mom and she reminded me of this. She was at the park and suddenly she had this severe headache. And she started acting differently. And Mom and Dad knew something went wrong. They took her to the emergency room and she was in the emergency room a few times. And finally she kept on getting worse, so she was hospitalized. And we discovered that she had this severe brain infection that was caused by a virus called HSV. HSV is a very common virus. It floats around. We all have it. It comes in two forms, HSV1 and HSV2. HSV1 is the one that pretty much lives above the belt. It's around our nasal tracts. We all carry it. We're all carriers for it. It normally stays there. It will occasionally cause something called cold sores. But that's pretty much as bad as it gets for 99% of us, right? For a very few of us who are very unlucky, HSV will occasionally get in the central nervous system. It will get in the brain. And the way it gets there is probably through the olfactory nerve, although nobody is completely sure. So that nerve that serves to smell. Once it gets in the brain, it is a catastrophe. So most viral infections to the brain are not a big deal. Most of the time, if you have a viral encephalitis, we see this every year. We have a number of these cases every year. You come to the hospital, and the parents are all surprised because we tell you, well, your child has a viral encephalitis. They're going to have a really bad headache. They're going to be really slow, and they're going to struggle for the next 3 to 4 weeks. But you can take them home. There's absolutely nothing we can do for them in the hospital. It'll take them a few weeks to recover, and they recover on their own. This is the exception. There are a few exceptions. There are a few viruses that are a catastrophe. This is one of them. HSV encephalitis is the worst catastrophe. It is a virus that attacks a part of the brain that is responsible for emotions and memory and the ability to plan things in space. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, because those are the parts of the brain that were affected in Alyssa. So Alyssa was treated. You treat it with a drug called acyclovir. It's a 6 weeks course, and she recovered. But she got home, and they had a very different little girl. A little girl who was perfectly normal, doing well in school before that. Now, all of a sudden, it was a little girl who was becoming very angry, violent at times. She could be very antagonistic toward others. She would attack other children and her parents. She also had this strange thing where she got home, she couldn't go from her bedroom to her bathroom anymore. And Mom was like, what is happening? I don't understand this. And, this is the home she had grown up in. She couldn't find her own bathroom anymore. And she started displaying some very bizarre, inappropriate behaviors. And I met Alyssa several months later. And this is what had happened to Alyssa. So, do we have a laser by any chance? A laser pointer?
There might be one.
If not, I can just point.
So they got a bunch of stuff up here. They call it the doll box, but they have no idea. That'd be a no.
That's all right. So if you look at this, the part of the brain that affected, so this is actually Alyssa's brain. Okay, this is her MRI. I chose a couple of slides of Alyssa's MRI when she was acutely sick. And what you can see is in this MRI, the sick part of the brain is the very white part. So you can see that all of this is sick. And all of this is sick, right? Can you appreciate that? This is much wider. It's very angry. This is angry brain, okay? Now this is cutting through the brain like this. So both ears would be right here and the eyes are up here. So this is all very angry brain. Very angry brain. Now if you look at it from a different point of view, so you cut through the brain like this, what you can see is this middle part of the brain right here, right? Very, very angry there. All of that on both sides. Now there are several keys here. The first one is that this affects a part of the brain that sits in the middle part, lower part of the brain, right? That part of the brain is called the temporal lobes. And this is the middle part of the temporal lobes. And that is what HSV does. That is where HSV goes. Okay? It destroys the middle part of the brain, the temporal lobes. Now, it has another, what happens usually when you're affected with HSV encephalitis is there's a little structure in the middle of the brain that sits right around here at the very front. That is called the hippocampus. That part of the brain allows you to form short-term memories. If you lose it, you can no longer form short-term memories. There is a beautiful book out there that's called Forever Today, I think, which is the story of a British gentleman who had HSV encephalitis, and both of his hippocampus were affected by this disease. And as a result, he loses all memory. You see him, you spend 30 seconds with him, you walk away, you come back, he will have no memory that he has met you. This is the same thing that happens to people who have Alzheimer's disease, right? People who have Alzheimer's disease, the part of their brain that dies is the hippocampus. Now, in order to have injury, in order to have this symptom, there's a big key here. Both sides need to be injured. So, the nice thing about the brain is we have one on each side. And for all of those medial parts of the brain, all of those parts that sit in the middle of the brain, that is our most primitive brain. That is the brain that goes back to the days when we were lizards. Okay? That is the part of the brain that we share with lizards and reptiles, and that is the part of the brain that is all of our instinctual functioning, right? That part of the brain is very cross-wired. So as long as we have one intact, we can still function. But if both are gone, we're in trouble. In Alyssa, both are gone. She has destroyed both sides. They're gone. Now what does that mean? Let's look at that a little bit. So, HSV encephalitis. I talked about it already. So it's one of the viral causes of encephalitis. It is one of the rare ones that is really a catastrophe. Now, this is not like bacterial meningitis, right? Which can be a really, really bad thing. Most viral encephalitis are fine. The virus has a special affinity for the temporal lobe. We talked about that. And if both temporal lobes are affected, function is irreversibly lost. Now, we're going to dissect away what functions those are. And what the functions those are? Well, memory, affect, basic human emotions in the sense of where I am. All right? Now, so what is Kluver-Bucy syndrome? Let me go to this slide first, because this helps understand a little better Alyssa. So, what you notice here is what this picture of the brain is this, what I have here is this very middle part of the brain. This is called the limbic cortex. It sits in the very inside of the brain, right? What they're representing right there is the brain wrapping around this very primitive part of the brain called the limbic cortex. The limbic cortex is again that primitive part of the brain, that part of the brain that we share with reptiles, etc. That part of the brain that controls very basic human emotions. So let's break this down. The olfactory bulb is smelling. You remember how I said that's probably how the virus gets in your brain? No wonder this is the part of the brain that is attacked, right? The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that controls all of the basic functions, such as hunger, thirst. And now guess what happens to children who have Kluver-Bucy syndrome? They often will develop something called hyperphagia. They start eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and eating, and you can't stop them anymore. Okay? That is caused by injury to the hypothalamus. What else does the hypothalamus regulate? Temperature, sleep. I have another little girl with a very similar infection who developed this regulation of temperature as a result of injury to her hypothalamus. Well, let's move down. What is this? This structure right there is the amygdala. This is going to be the key structure for Alyssa. Because in Alyssa's case, it is not so much the hippocampus that got injured, it is much more the amygdala. And the amygdala on both sides. This is what defines Kluver-Bucy syndrome. Extraordinarily rare. It requires both of the amygdala to be shot. So what do the amygdala do? What is the role of the amygdala? The amygdala is the part of your brain that regulates your most basic emotions, your sense of anger, your sense of fear, your sense of fright. So for example, without the amygdala, you cannot form emotional memories. Let me give you an example. They've seen this in adults. If you try in adults who have their amygdalas eliminated, you put them in a situation where, for example, you show them a picture. This is called conditioning, right? You show them a picture, a basic picture of, I don't know, a cat. And then you show them a bunch of other pictures. Every time you show them a picture of a cat, I don't like cats, so this is, I'm not a cat, I'm a dog person, right? So every time you show them a picture of a cat, you play a really loud noise, okay? And eventually the person starts learning that, you know, the cat is associated with their loud noise. And so if you record from their fingers, how much they sweat, their blood pressure, etc., what you will find is that you can just show the cat, and they will have the fear response, okay? After a while. You've done this a few times. This is conditioning. I think you've all heard about conditioning. You know what it is. Pavlov was the first guy who really did it in the dogs, right? So, but you can do that. So fear conditioning, emotional conditioning is driven by the amygdala. You get rid of the amygdala, so you now take patients with the amygdala, all right? You show them the picture of the cat, you put the bell, and then you continue showing the picture of the cat. They will remember that the bell is associated with the cat and it is unpleasant, but they will have no fear reaction to it. So if you record how much they sweat, you record their blood pressure, you record all of those things, no changes. So these people have lost the ability to form any memory associated with emotions. This is a bit of a complex concept to grab, but it is essential to grab because this is Alyssa's story, and this is Alyssa's story that we're telling today, right? Now, most people who have HSV infection have their hippocampi, the hippocampus, that structure that is right in the middle there, that is destroyed. And that is the part that is destroyed when you have Alzheimer's disease. That is the part that is responsible for forming short-term memories. In other words, I walk in this morning, I tell you, hello, I'm J.B. Lepichon. I walk out, I walk back in 30 seconds later. If your hippocampi are not functioning, you will have no clue you ever saw me. You'll say again, hello, very pleased to meet you, what's your name? Okay, and if you have family with Alzheimer's disease, it's very sad, but this is what happens. So, and finally, the frontal lobe. We're going to talk a lot more about the frontal lobe later today, but the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that makes us fundamentally the human beings we are. The frontal lobe is the most developed part of the brain. It's what makes us different from any other animal out there. Our frontal lobes are more developed than any other animal, right? This is why we have these big foreheads. The frontal lobes sit right there, right? The frontal lobes are responsible for what? They're responsible for maintaining our attention on things that we're not interested in. They are responsible for suppressing impulses. They're responsible for allowing us to be social beings. So the reason you're not jumping out of your seat out there this morning and telling me, Dr. Lepichon, you're boring the out of me, is because your frontal lobes are working and they're teaching you and they're telling you you shouldn't do that. Now, there are some very sad conditions where the frontal lobes stop working. Right? One such condition is called frontotemporal dementia. This is the worst type of dementia anybody could ever have. Why? In Alzheimer's, you lose your memory. It's very sad, right? But in frontotemporal dementia, you lose your ability to function as a human being. So I'll never forget, as a resident, I was at the VA, and I was taking care of a colonel. He had been very high level in the army, men of much distinction. He was completely disinhibited. He was walking around in the hallways naked if we weren't careful. He was sexually very, very inappropriate. This is a man who had been completely normal his entire life. There's an old story that goes back a century ago. We've known for over a century what the frontal lobes do. We've known that from an old story. There was this railroad worker at the end of the 19th century who was working. He was one of the best foremen they had. You know, the railroad workers back then, they had to use this dynamite to blow up the tunnels, right? And so they would drill a hole, they would put the dynamite in it, and then they would put a big rod on top of it, a rod about this long, big iron rod on top of it, right? And it would explode the rock, and it would make a big hole, right? What happened is, and that he was one of the best foremen that they had. What happened is he was in an accident where the rod was blown out, and it went across his skull and across his frontal lobe, and it disconnected a part of his frontal lobe. He walked away from that incident. Now the rod was about this thick. He walked away from that incident. But for the rest of his life, he wasn't able to work anymore. He became very inappropriate. He started using swear words, which he had never done before. He was disinhibited, right? He ended up dying as a homeless person on the streets of San Francisco. The doctor who had taken care of him found him after he was dead, preserved his skull, and we've had much studies done on that skull ever since. Now, what was a follow-up to that? In the 1940s, there was a Spanish doctor who came along and said, I know what the frontal lobe does. I bet you if I get rid of it, I can get rid of inappropriate behaviors. You've probably heard of this. this doctor invented a procedure called lobotomy. So what he would do is he would go through the eyes, he would run this little tool, and he would cut all of the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. At the time, they didn't have much medications in terms of psychiatric medications, right? It worked wonderfully. The first woman that he tried them on became the most docile people ever. In fact, they were so docile, pretty much the only thing they ever did was lay down in bed and slept and ate, and that was it. They had no personality left. This guy received the Nobel Prize for this invention. We did lobotomies until the 1960s. In the late 1960s was the last lobotomy. So this is a little introduction to what these parts of the brain do. It is important for you to understand what these parts of the brains do for two reasons, right? There's a point to my telling you all these stories, right? The first one is so you can understand Alyssa. The second one is in the context of the talk that we will have right after this, so you can understand your kids. And that you understand that the disorders your kids have are not disorders that you can fix. These parts of the brain that are affected are gone. All right? You wouldn't take a diabetic who has no pancreas and expect that diabetic to start making insulin again, would you? You can't take a patient who has no amygdala and expect that patient to do the functions that the amygdala normally would make. They can't. Now, you can help the diabetic avoid sugar, right? You can help the diabetic avoid situations that are going to get them in trouble, right? You can potentially replace some of their insulin. We're going to try to help Alyssa, and I will tell you a few ways that we can do this. So, this goes back to Kluver-Bucy syndrome. What is it? This is in adults. In adults, bilateral injury to a region of the brain called the amygdala, basic emotions, we talked about that. Other temporal regions are often associated, the hippocampus, we talked about the hippocampus, the parahippocampal gyrus, we also talked about. The temporal parietal region, so these affect memories, processing memories, and spatial location, right? The classic presentation for Kluver-Bucy syndrome is visual agnosia, which is the inability to recognize common objects. Hyperorality, which is you take everything you find and you put it to your mouth. Hypermetamorphosis, which is this unusual, almost need to go and find anything that you see and touch it and start manipulating it and putting it to your mouth. Placidity, which is one of the regions these kids are at so much risk, okay? That is that basically almost anyone can walk up to them and make them do almost anything they want. Loss of the normal fear and anger response, so they have no fear. And you cannot teach them to have fear, they do not have the ability to have it. So guess what? Punishment isn't going to work. Punishment works on the basis of fear. Changes in dietary habits, so they develop hyperphagia, so they start eating and eating. And less frequently memory disturbance and seizures. Well, what about children? Children are different. Kluver-Bucy syndrome in children is different. So, there are so far 26 cases in the world reported of Kluver-Bucy syndrome in children. Now, I have not published Alyssa. I have not reported her, but this gives you a sense of how rare this is. 26 reported cases. Of those, 8 are caused by HSV. 88% of the kids, hyperorality and hypersexuality, right? This is caused directly by the amygdala being affected. So these kids go around and have very inappropriate behaviors. Now you can imagine a child who's hyperdocile and hypersexual and pretty. What kind of trouble they're going to get into, right? They are a walking catastrophe for anybody to take advantage of them. In addition, bulimia, eating excessively, seizures, emotional and behavior disturbances are a big one, up to 70%. And the emotional and behavior disturbances can be extreme. So they will attack people around them. They will attack the people they love the most. They will attack their pets. They have very, very, very disturbing and bizarre behaviors. And finally, what you notice is that in children, visual agnosia, hypermetamorphosis, and placidity are not as prominent. So the typical course, the first changes, this is exactly what happened to Alyssa, right? Irritability, violence toward others and pets, uncontrolled screaming, social disinhibition, all right? Disinhibition means, you know that kid who's in your school and you ask a question and they raise their hand and go, me. That's disinhibition. You wouldn't do that, right? In fact, we become so inhibited, so our frontal lobes are functioning so well that if I ask a question of the group right now, I'll have a hard time getting a single person to answer, right? Because our frontal lobe are functioning so well. They're actually sometimes functioning too well, right? How do we get around that? Well, one way that we get around that is we drink alcohol. Why? Because alcohol shuts the frontal lobe down. What happens when we drink alcohol? We become disinhibited, right? And we do all sorts of things that we regret the next day. That's why. Right? Difficulty focusing and sustained attention, hyperactivity are a big feature. This is a theme we're going to come back to. Because we're going to see this happen again later on with the kids who are exposed to prenatal drug exposure. Hyperorality, putting things to their mouth all the time. Hypersexuality, weight gain. Cognitive impairments. Almost every single one of these kids has some element of cognitive impairment. Now what do I mean by that? Now a typical IQ is 100, right? The average kid has an IQ of 100. That means that their intelligence is the same as 50% of the other kids their age. That's what an IQ of 100 means, right? An IQ less than 70 is considered a cognitive impairment, right? The old word we used for that was mental retardation, which we've done away with, right? Between 80 and 100 is considered normal. However, there's no doubt that these kids, a kid with an IQ of 85 or 90 is not the same as a kid with an IQ of 115 or 120, right? Which is still considered normal. 80 to 120 is considered normal. These are the kids that you deal every day with in your classroom. You've got a kid with an 85 and a kid with a 115, and what do you do? Right, this is your challenge. This is the thing that you deal with the most with, right? Well, these kids on average have an IQ with that ranges between 85 and 95. So they all have a drop in their IQ. And epilepsy, which Alyssa. All right, treatment. No good treatment, unfortunately. We cannot replace the amygdala. It's gone. These kids, that part of their brain is destroyed. It is gone. It is never coming back. Right? So if you have a person with a stroke, right, what happens is a part of their brain, say the left parietal region that controls the right parietal region that controls the left half of the body is going to die, right? So what happens to these people is they develop a hemiparesis, right? You see them walking like this, right? That's what happens when you have a stroke, because that part of the body doesn't move anymore. You would not expect that person to start walking normally again, would you? You still give them physical therapy, but you wouldn't expect them to start walking normally, would you? Same thing here. That part of the brain is gone. So, no good treatment. SSRIs can be helpful, and this is something I think I haven't tried in Alyssa yet. Anti-epileptics. Alyssa is on several anti-epileptics. Tegretol and Lamictal have been proven to be especially effective, so we still have lots of things we can, try with Alyssa that I can try to help. These are all things that I do. Clonidine Can be very helpful to help with sleep problems, because a lot of these children have sleep problems. Methylphenidate or any of the amphetamines, any of the stimulants can be helpful with attention. Strong family and social support with rigid structure is incredibly important. This is where you come in. You need a structure, the same type of structure that you would provide with a kid with autism, right? Children with autism, their main problem is they cannot deal with change. They really struggle with change, right? So you provide them with a rigid structure. It's every day the same thing. You do the same thing every day, and as much as you can. It's the same classroom, it's the same teacher, it's the same hours, etc., 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 right? This kind of stuff. And lots of patience and love. Once you realize, once you understand that this child has a brain, part of the brain that is gone, I think it is easier to do that. It is real. The problem with Alyssa is it is really hard to be patient and to be loving and to be accepting of some of her behaviors, right? When she comes toward you, or when she finds someone and she starts rubbing her crotch inappropriately on their leg, or she starts touching herself inappropriately, that is very offensive to us, isn't it? Or if she performs something, she becomes excessively angry, and nothing that you do, no amount of punishment redirects her. That is very frustrating, isn't it? If you understand the nature of her injury, it becomes easier to understand that and to accept that and to help Alyssa move forward.